The sinister base discovered that the military tried to hide. They never found the soldier's face, only the helmet, twisted and fused with something organic, something alive. The body was intact, but the eyes were gone, replaced by deep black voids that seemed to swallow the light. The last thing the patrol heard before the radio went silent was his ragged breathing, and then a voice, not his, whispering, "They're watching. They're here." So, deep in the Nevada desert, beyond even the most classified maps, lies Site Echo. The Nevada desert is an unforgiving expanse, a vast, desolate wasteland where the sun's brutal glare bleaches the earth by day and the biting cold suffocates it by night. It's a place where time seems to stretch, where isolation presses against your chest like an invisible weight. Somewhere within this barren nothingness lies Site Echo. Officially, it doesn't exist. There's no mention of it in government documents, no satellite imagery to mark its location. But the locals know better. They speak in hushed tones about black, unmarked helicopters flying low over the dunes and convoys of military trucks kicking up clouds of dust at odd hours. To outsiders, it's a ghost story, a paranoid delusion whispered in diners and dive bars. But for those unlucky enough to stumble too close, it's the last thing they'll ever hear. Beneath the cracked surface of the desert, where the sun's heat can't reach, lies a labyrinth carved into the earth, a sprawling, cold expanse of steel and concrete. Site Echo's existence has always been shrouded in layers of obfuscation, buried under countless levels of classified information. What little is known has been pieced together by whistleblowers who disappear soon after speaking out. They describe a facility unlike any other, miles of sterile corridors, soundproofed walls, and security measures so extreme they make Area 51 seem like a tourist attraction. But the most chilling accounts come from former soldiers who served there, their testimonies riddled with tremors of fear they can't quite suppress. The air within Site Echo is unlike anything you'd find on the surface. It's heavy, almost oppressive, filled with an unnatural stillness that makes even breathing feel intrusive. Soldiers often describe it as dead air, the kind of silence that amplifies every sound, turning the softest whispers into echoes that linger too long. It smells faintly of ozone, as if a lightning storm had passed through, and something else, something metallic, sharp and sickly sweet, like blood left to congeal in the heat. Veterans of the facility talk about a low, incessant hum that seems to emanate from the very walls. At first, they dismiss it as background noise, the hum of machinery or ventilation systems, but the longer they stay, the more the sound changes. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it begins to take on a rhythm, pulsing, alive. Rumors circulate among the soldiers stationed there, whispered late at night in the barracks when the hum feels louder, closer. They speak of shadows that move without a source, fleeting shapes that dart across their peripheral vision. At first, they chalk it up to exhaustion or the dim, flickering fluorescent lights that never seem to hold steady. But the stories don't stop there. Some claim to hear voices in the silence, faint murmurs just beyond the threshold of comprehension. Others report doors unlocking themselves, opening to reveal empty corridors that seem darker than they should be. But the worst are the disappearances. Soldiers who go missing during their shift, leaving behind nothing but their gear. No one speaks of them officially, but their absence lingers like a ghost, a hole that can't be filled. And then, there's the hum. It becomes more than just a sound. Soldiers begin to hear it even in their sleep, a low vibration that burrows into their thoughts like a parasite. They report headaches that never quite fade, a gnawing anxiety that grows with each passing day. Some claim to see patterns in the sound, shapes forming in the rhythm that don't belong in this world. They try to describe it, twisting, impossible geometry that defies logic, but the words never come out right. Others don't speak at all, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling as if they're afraid of what they might say. One soldier, a sergeant named Billings, left a journal behind after his 6-month rotation. It was found tucked under his mattress, its pages filled with frantic scrawls. His handwriting starts out neat, disciplined, but as the entries progress, it becomes jagged, almost violent. He writes of the hum, of how it seemed to speak to him, filling his head with thoughts that weren't his own. It's not just a sound. One entry reads, "It's alive. It wants something." By the final pages, his writing devolves into incoherent ramblings, repeating the same phrase over and over. "We were never meant to find this. Site Echo's design doesn't help." The facility is a maze of identical corridors, their cold, sterile surfaces devoid of personality. The lighting is harsh, casting sharp shadows that distort perception. Soldiers quickly lose their sense of direction, even with maps and guidance systems. Some swear the corridors shift, that doors appear and disappear at random. They describe a sensation of being watched, as if the walls themselves had eyes. But when they turn to look, there's nothing there, just their own distorted reflection in the polished steel. The base's purpose is classified beyond top secret, but speculation runs wild. Some believe it's a research facility, a place where scientists experiment with technology far beyond human understanding. Others think it's a containment site, holding something so dangerous it had to be buried deep beneath the earth. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Site Echo is not a place for the living. Those who leave rarely talk about their time there, their silence a testament to the horrors they witnessed. And those who don't leave, well, their fates remain a mystery, lost to the shadows of a facility that was never meant to exist. Outside, the desert stretches on, an ocean of sand that hides its secrets well. The world above goes about its business, blissfully unaware of what lies below. But sometimes late at night, locals claim to hear strange noises carried on the wind, a faint hum that makes their bones ache, their teeth chatter. Some say it's the sound of machinery deep underground. Others think it's something else, something alive. Sergeant Daniel Harper knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the main corridor. Sergeant Daniel Harper was no stranger to unsettling assignments. Having served in some of the most remote and dangerous locations during his decade-long military career, he'd seen his fair share of chaos. But nothing, no hostile battlefield or desolate outpost, had prepared him for the suffocating unease that gripped him as he stepped into Site Echo's main corridor. The air felt wrong, like stepping into a room where something terrible had happened, but no one would say a word. It wasn't just the flickering fluorescent lights that made shadows dance unnaturally on the steel walls. It was the weight of the place. Every step felt heavier, as if the gravity was slightly off, pulling him down in more ways than one. The corridor stretched on, endlessly, a cold, sterile path that seemed designed to strip away any sense of humanity. The walls gleamed with an unnatural polish, reflecting fragmented pieces of Harper's own distorted figure back at him. He noticed something strange. His reflection didn't seem to move in sync with him. A trick of the light, he told himself, though his gut tightened with unease. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, the sound bouncing back at odd intervals, as though the space itself was alive, listening to him, tracking his every move. He reached for his radio, an instinctive attempt to ground himself in the familiarity of protocol. But all that came through was static, a grating hiss that seemed to rise and fall in time with the flickering lights. Harper adjusted the frequency, his hands trembling slightly despite his efforts to stay composed. Beneath the static, he thought he heard something. Not a voice exactly, but a sound like breathing, ragged, uneven, and impossibly close. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he strained to listen. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Just the equipment, he muttered under his breath, his voice sounding small and hollow in the cavernous space. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. As Harper moved deeper into the corridor, the shadows began to play tricks on him, or at least, that's what he told himself. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, disappearing the moment he turned his head. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of his peripheral vision, the result of exhaustion and the unnerving lighting. but the shapes grew bolder. One moment, he was alone in the corridor. The next, he caught the fleeting impression of a figure. Tall, thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, just behind him. When he spun around, his hand on his sidearm, the corridor was empty. Yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and the sensation of being watched was so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. "Identify yourself," Harper barked, his voice echoing down the empty hall. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment he wished he hadn't spoken at all. It was as if the act of calling out had acknowledged whatever was lurking in the shadows, inviting it closer. Then he saw it. At the far end of the corridor, bathed in the stuttering light of a dying fluorescent bulb, was a figure. It stood perfectly still, its back to him, dressed in what appeared to be a standard military uniform. Relief flooded through Harper's chest. Another soldier, someone who could explain this madness. But as he squinted, his relief turned to dread. Something was wrong with the figure. The proportions were off. The arms seemed too long, the shoulders unnaturally hunched, as though the figure's body had been twisted and reshaped into something that only vaguely resembled a human form. "Hey!" Harper called out, his voice shaking despite his efforts to keep it steady. "Turn around. Identify yourself." The figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the cold glow of the corridor. Harper took a cautious step forward, then another, his grip tightening on the handle of his weapon. Each step echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. As he drew closer, he noticed the faintest sound, a low, wet, squelching noise, like something soft being crushed underfoot. The figure turned, slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural, as if its joints were made of rusted metal. Harper froze, his breath catching in his throat. The thing's face, or rather the place where its face should have been, was nothing but a smooth expanse of pale, featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank, lifeless flesh stretched over bone. Harper's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure tilted its head, the motion eerily slow and deliberate, as if it were studying him. And then it took a step forward. Panic surged through Harper, breaking the paralysis that had gripped him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure began to move, its gait uneven, its limbs jerking with every step. The wet, squelching noise grew louder, echoing off the walls as the thing advanced. Harper raised his weapon, his hands shaking so violently he could barely aim. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I said, stay back." The figure didn't stop. It moved with a terrifying inevitability, its faceless head tilted as if listening to something Harper couldn't hear. The hum in the walls grew louder, a pulsing vibration that seemed to sync with his racing heartbeat. Harper pulled the trigger, the sharp crack of the gunshot splitting the silence. The figure didn't react. The bullet struck its chest, but instead of blood, a dark, viscous liquid oozed from the wound, pooling on the floor like tar. The thing paused, its head tilting slightly to one side, almost as if it were curious. Then it took another step forward. Harper didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, the sound of his own panicked breathing drowning out the hum that now seemed to reverberate through his entire body. The corridor stretched on endlessly, the lights flickering more erratically as if the base itself were falling apart. Behind him, the squelching footsteps of the figure echoed relentlessly, growing louder, closer. By the time Harper reached the end of the corridor, his legs felt like lead, his lungs burning with every gasping breath. He slammed his fist against the control panel of the nearest door, praying it would open. It did, but just as he threw himself inside, he caught one last glimpse of the figure. It had stopped in the middle of the corridor, its faceless head tilted once more. Harper could have sworn it was smiling. Harper's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as the door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in a dimly lit control room. The sound of the door locking sent a momentary wave of relief through Harper's chest, but it didn't last. The oppressive hum that had chased him through the corridor still pressed against his skull, relentless and alive. vibrating in his bones like some malevolent force trying to tear him apart from the inside. The control room was small, claustrophobic, with walls lined by flickering monitors that cast erratic shadows across the steel panels. A faint smell of burned electronics lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of his sweat. He leaned against the nearest wall, his body trembling, his chest heaving as he tried to pull himself back from the edge of panic. The monitors displayed a grainy feed of various parts of site echo. Most of the screens were filled with empty hallways, identical to the one he'd just fled. But there was something wrong with the footage. The cameras jittered and glitched at irregular intervals, creating distorted frames where the shadows seemed to warp and writhe like living things. Harper's eyes darted between the screens, searching for signs of life, but the corridors remained eerily still. Then, on one of the monitors, he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, sliding across the far end of the screen. Harper's heart skipped a beat as the shadow grew larger, taking shape. The faceless figure was there, moving with the same unnatural, jerky gait he'd seen before. Its movements were almost insect-like, its long limbs twitching as it stalked through the corridor, stopping occasionally to tilt its head as if it were sniffing the air. Harper's stomach churned as he realized the figure was heading toward the control room. He tore his gaze from the monitor, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had to think, had to act. His training screamed at him to assess the situation, to regain control. But Site Echo didn't play by the rules of reality. Everything about this place, the sounds, the shadows, the oppressive atmosphere, felt designed to unravel his mind. He glanced around the room, searching for anything that could help. A row of buttons and switches lined the console in front of him, each one labeled with cryptic designations that meant nothing to him. A flickering screen displayed a map of the facility, but it was incomplete, with entire sections blacked out, as though the base itself refused to reveal its secrets. The hum in the walls grew louder, a throbbing pulse that seemed to sync with his racing heartbeat. Harper pressed his hands to his ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a presence, an invasive force that wormed its way into his thoughts. His vision blurred, his mind reeling as fragments of alien shapes and incomprehensible symbols flashed behind his eyes. He stumbled, gripping the edge of the console to steady himself. The hum seemed to laugh at him, mocking his feeble attempt to resist. Then the monitors flickered again, and a new image appeared. It was the control room, viewed from a high corner angle. Harper saw himself on the screen, hunched over the console, his face pale and drenched in sweat. But something was wrong. On the monitor, the room wasn't empty. Behind him, standing just inside the door, was the figure. A cold dread gripped Harper's spine as he spun around, his weapon raised. The door was closed, the room empty, but he could feel it. The same oppressive weight of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. He turned back to the monitor, but the image was gone. The screen now displayed static, white noise that hissed and popped like distant whispers. Harper's breathing grew ragged, his hands trembling as he gripped his sidearm. The door to the control room suddenly rattled, the sound sharp and jarring against the relentless hum. Harper's stomach clenched as he stared at the handle, his mind racing. The rattling grew more violent, metal screeching against metal, as if something on the other side was clawing at it, trying to force its way in. He took a step back, his weapon trained on the door, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Identify yourself." The response was a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. It seeped through the crack beneath the door, a wet, slithering noise that made Harper's skin crawl. His mind conjured images of something oozing and writhing on the other side, something that defied all logic and reason. The door groaned under the pressure, the handle twisting slightly, as if the thing on the other side was learning, adapting. Harper's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The control room was a dead end, a trap. His only option was to stand his ground. He tightened his grip on the weapon, his knuckles white, and took a shaky breath. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm armed!" The rattling stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, the room was silent save for the ever-present hum. Harper's heart pounded in the silence, each beat echoing in his ears like a countdown. And then, the lights flickered. When they came back on, Harper wasn't alone. The figure stood in the corner of the room, its faceless head tilted in that unnerving, almost curious way. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the small space with a suffocating aura of dread. Harper's vision swam as the hum grew deafening, drilling into his skull like 1,000 screaming voices. He raised his weapon, his hands trembling so violently he could barely aim. "Don't come any closer," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't listen. It took a step forward, its movements impossibly smooth now like liquid shadow. Harper fired, the deafening crack of the gunshot ringing out in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the figure square in the chest, but it didn't react. Instead, its body seemed to ripple, the dark, tar-like substance from before oozing from the wound and pooling on the floor. Harper stumbled back, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The figure took another step, and the lights flickered again. This time, when they came back, the figure was gone. But the room wasn't empty. On the floor where the figure had stood, the dark substance writhed and bubbled, forming shapes that Harper's mind couldn't comprehend. They twisted and shifted, impossible geometries that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Harper's stomach churned as he stared, unable to look away. And then, from the center of the writhing mass, a single word echoed in his mind, spoken in a voice that wasn't his own. "Run." Harper didn't need to be told twice. Harper burst through the nearest door, his legs trembling as he entered a cavernous chamber unlike any other part of the facility. The metallic, utilitarian design of Site Echo gave way to something almost organic. The walls were no longer sleek panels of steel, but instead appeared to be made of a strange, pulsating material. Veins of faintly glowing green light ran across the surface, throbbing in rhythm with the ever-present hum that now seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Harper's footsteps echoed unnaturally, a hollow, distorted sound that didn't match the movement of his boots. It was as though the room swallowed and twisted every noise, bending it into something alien. Harper's first instinct was to back away, to retreat the way he came. But the door had already slammed shut behind him. He didn't even need to check it. He could feel that it was locked, as if the room had sealed him in deliberately. His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in panicked jerks as his eyes darted around the space. It was massive, far larger than any room he had encountered in the facility. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. Every inhale felt like breathing in something alive, something that was coiling its way into his lungs and planting itself deep inside him. In the center of the chamber stood a towering structure that defied explanation. It was neither a machine nor an organism, yet it seemed to be both. The base was composed of interlocking metallic plates that shimmered like liquid mercury, but as Harper's eyes traveled upward, the material shifted. It became translucent, revealing a writhing core of pulsating, sinewy strands that glowed faintly in the dim light. The strands twisted and coiled in impossible patterns, moving as though they were alive. Harper's stomach churned at the sight, a deep, primal revulsion taking hold of him. His brain struggled to process what he was seeing, as if the structure wasn't meant to be perceived by human eyes. The hum grew louder the closer he stepped toward the structure. A low, droning vibration that felt like it was burrowing into his skull. Harper clutched his head, wincing as the sound resonated through his mind, dredging up flashes of incomprehensible images, shapes he couldn't recognize, symbols that seemed older than time, and faces, twisted, elongated faces with black, empty eyes that stared straight into his soul. He stumbled, his knees buckling as the visions overwhelmed him. "Focus," He muttered to himself through gritted teeth. His voice sounded alien in the space, warped and distorted as though the room itself was mocking him. "Focus, damn it." As Harper forced himself to stand, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. His head snapped toward the far end of the chamber, where the shadows seemed to ripple and shift. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then he saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was unlike the faceless entity he had encountered before. This one had a form, but it was wrong, impossibly wrong. The figure was humanoid in shape, but stretched and distorted, its limbs far too long and its torso unnaturally thin. Its skin was an iridescent black, shimmering like oil under faint light, and it moved with a horrifying fluidity, as though its bones were made of liquid. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its empty eye sockets locked onto Harper. He couldn't tell if it was staring at him or through him, but the sensation was the same. It was stripping him bare, peeling away the layers of his mind to expose his deepest fears. Harper raised his weapon, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely aim. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements so smooth they were almost hypnotic. The hum intensified with each step it took, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to sync with Harper's pounding heartbeat. His finger hovered over the trigger, sweat dripping into his eyes as he tried to steady his aim. The creature stopped abruptly, its head tilting the other way. Harper felt his knees weaken as a sound filled the chamber, a low, guttural clicking that reverberated off the walls. It wasn't a natural sound. It was too sharp, too deliberate, like a predator signaling its intent. Harper's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Suddenly, the structure in the center of the room came alive. The strands within it began to writhe more violently, their glowing intensifying as they moved in patterns that made Harper's head throb. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Harper's vision blurred as he felt the walls themselves begin to close in. And then, without warning, the strands shot outward, extending across the room like serpents. One of them lashed toward Harper, and he barely managed to dive out of the way. The strand struck the ground where he had been standing, leaving a smoldering scorch mark. The creature took another step toward him, its clicking growing louder, more frenzied. Harper scrambled to his feet, his weapon clattering to the floor in his panic. The strand lashed out again, this time grazing his arm. A searing pain shot through him as the material burned his skin, leaving behind a blackened, oozing wound. Harper cried out, clutching his arm as he stumbled backward. The creature was closer now, its eyeless gaze fixed on him, its movements becoming more aggressive. Harper's back hit the wall, and he realized with a sinking dread that he had nowhere left to go. The hum was deafening now, a cacophony of noise that drowned out his thoughts. The strands from the structure were closing in, writhing like living chains. The creature raised one elongated arm, its claw-like fingers reaching toward him. In that moment, Harper felt something snap inside him, not a physical break, but a mental one. His fear, his panic, his desperation all collapsed into a singular thought: survival. With a guttural scream, he lunged for his fallen weapon, his fingers wrapping around the grip just as the creature's claws grazed his chest. He fired blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the chamber in brief, violent bursts. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. Harper didn't stop. He kept firing until the clip was empty, his ears ringing from the deafening shots. The strands from the structure recoiled, retreating back into the core, and the creature melted into the shadows, its form dissipating like smoke. The chamber fell silent, the hum reducing to a faint whisper. Harper collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The air was still thick, oppressive, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. He glanced at the structure in the center of the room, its glowing core now dim and still. But Harper knew better than to think it was over. Harper stumbled out of the chamber, his legs barely able to carry him, but what greeted him beyond the door was far worse. The corridor was no longer the sterile metallic hallway he had known before. Instead, it had transformed into a grotesque maze of warped walls, dripping with a viscous black substance that reflected the faint glow of the emergency lights. The substance oozed down the walls like tar, pooling on the floor in unnatural patterns that pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Harper's boots squelched with each step, the sticky liquid clinging to him as though it had a mind of its own. The air was heavy with a putrid stench, rot, metal, and something far more alien that made his stomach churn. The lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that danced and writhed like living creatures. Harper's breathing was ragged, his throat raw from screaming, but he couldn't stop. The door behind him had sealed shut with a thunderous clang, leaving him no choice but to push forward into the nightmare that awaited. His flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely penetrating the oppressive darkness ahead. It was as if the very fabric of the corridor was absorbing the light, swallowing it whole. As Harper pressed on, he became acutely aware of the sound, a faint, wet, slithering noise that seemed to echo from every direction. At first, it was distant, almost imperceptible, but with each step it grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the random sound of water dripping or machinery malfunctioning. It was purposeful, calculated, like something dragging itself closer. Harper's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse echoing in his ears as he fought the urge to look back. He reached an intersection in the corridor, the path branching off in 3 directions. Each route looked identical, a labyrinth of suffocating darkness and pulsating walls. Harper hesitated, his hands trembling as he tried to decide which way to go. The slithering noise grew louder, and now it was accompanied by a faint clicking sound, sharp and rhythmic, like claws tapping against metal. Panic set in. He chose the path to his right, breaking into a stumbling run as the sounds behind him intensified. The walls seemed to close in as he moved, the corridor narrowing and twisting in impossible ways. The black substance on the walls began to shift, forming patterns that Harper couldn't comprehend, symbols that hurt to look at, twisting and writhing like living things. His vision blurred as his mind struggled to process the impossible geometry around him, and for a moment, he felt as though he was being pulled out of his own body, his consciousness teetering on the edge of some unfathomable abyss. A sudden guttural roar erupted behind him, freezing Harper in his tracks. It was a sound that defied explanation, deep and primal, filled with a malice that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Harper turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip as he shone it down the corridor he had just come from. The beam illuminated the figure emerging from the darkness, and Harper's stomach dropped. It was the creature from the chamber, but now it was larger, more grotesque. Its limbs had elongated further, and its skin had taken on an even more unnatural sheen, as though it was covered in the same black substance that coated the walls. Its head was a pulsating mass of flesh, featureless except for a gaping maw that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. The clicking sound came from its clawed fingers, which scraped against the walls as it moved toward him with unnerving grace. Harper stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The creature's eyeless gaze seemed to pierce through him, filling him with a paralyzing dread that rooted him to the spot. It let out another roar, the sound reverberating through the corridor and rattling Harper's very bones. Somehow, Harper managed to break free of the creature's horrifying spell. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the sticky floor as the corridor twisted and warped around him. The walls seemed to shift with each step, the symbols glowing brighter and searing themselves into his mind. He could feel the creature behind him, its presence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The corridor opened into another room, and Harper burst through the threshold, his chest heaving as he collapsed to the ground. This room was different from the others, larger with a circular design and a high, domed ceiling. In the center of the room was another structure, similar to the one he had seen before, but even more grotesque. This one pulsed with a blinding white light. and the strands within it writhed more violently, their movements almost frantic. Harper's instincts screamed at him to destroy it, to end whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. But he had no weapon left. His rifle had been lost somewhere in the chaos, and his sidearm was empty. He crawled toward the structure, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. As he reached out to touch it, a voice echoed through the room. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are too late," it said, the words resonating deep within Harper's mind. It wasn't a human voice. It was cold, mechanical, yet layered with a sinister undertone that made his skin crawl. The awakening cannot be stopped. Harper's hand froze inches from the structure as the strands shot out, wrapping around his wrist and pulling him forward. He screamed, struggling against the impossible strength of the tendrils as they lifted him off the ground and suspended him in the air. The light grew brighter, searing his eyes and filling his vision with incomprehensible shapes and patterns. As the light consumed him, Harper's mind was flooded with knowledge, horrifying, incomprehensible knowledge of what the facility truly was. Sight Echo wasn't just a base. It was a doorway, a beacon calling out to something far beyond human understanding. The experiments, the disappearances, the creatures, they were all part of a greater plan, one that had been in motion long before humanity had even existed. The last thing Harper saw before the light swallowed him completely was the creature entering the room, its maw opening wide as it let out a triumphant roar. Then, everything went black. And that's how Harper's story ends. Or does it? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next terrifying tale. What do you think the government is hiding from us? Or better yet, do you dare to find out?